Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 1 January 2024. Today is the centenary of the birth of Arthur Danto, born 100 years ago today in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on this date in 1924. And Danto was very influential in analytical philosophy of history. There is almost a sense in which he could say he creates the field, especially in its current form. So he published Analytical Philosophy of History in 1965. That's the copy I have. And then 20 years later, in 1985, he issued a substantially expanded and revised version titled Narration and Knowledge. So right on the first page of Analytical Philosophy of History, Danto makes a distinction that's become very common and was already common by the time he wrote this in philosophy of history, when he writes, "Two distinct kinds of inquiry are covered by the expression philosophy of history. I shall refer to these as substantive and analytical philosophy of history. The first of these is connected with ordinary historical inquiry, which is to say that substantive philosophers of history, like historians, are concerned to give account of what happened in the past, though they are concerned to do something more than that, just that. Analytical philosophy of history, on the other hand, is not merely connected with philosophy, it is philosophy, but philosophy applied to the special conceptual problems which arise out of the practice of history, as well as out of substantive philosophy of history. Substantive philosophy of history is not really connected with philosophy at all, any more than history itself is. This book is an exercise in analytical philosophy of history." End of quote. This, as I said, has become a very common idea in philosophy that we find in several others. For example, Maurice Mandelbaum made the distinction, he called it a distinction between formal and material philosophy, as though he were applying Aristotelian hylomorphism to the problem. So, quote, "Just as the term history has come to have two fundamentally different meanings, the one referring to occurrences in the past and the other referring to the knowledge or the supposed knowledge of those occurrences, so the term philosophy of history has come to refer to two types of philosophic inquiry. These two types of inquiry are usually, and most conveniently, designated as formal and material philosophies of history. Briefly stated, a formal philosophy of history represents a philosophic concern with the problem of historical knowledge, while a material philosophy of history represents an attempt to interpret the historical process itself." And William Drey, whose philosophy of history I mentioned in my first video on getting started in philosophy of history, once again, on the very first page, makes a similar distinction. "An introduction to philosophy of history must begin by distinguishing two senses which the word history commonly bears. On the one hand, we use it to refer to the course of events, a certain stratum of reality, which historians make it their professional business to study. On the other, we use it to denote the historian's study itself. We mean by it a certain kind of inquiry into a certain kind of subject matter. Corresponding to these senses are philosophical disciplines, also referred to as speculative and critical philosophies of history. The speculative seeks to discover in history the course of events, a pattern or meaning which lies beyond the purview of ordinary historians. The critical endeavor to make clear the nature of the historian's own inquiry in order to locate it, as it were, on the map of knowledge." In another book, Drey gives this a slightly different formulation, which is, I think, interesting, when he calls speculative philosophy of history an inquiry not into the arguments and procedures of historians, but into the nature of the historical process itself. So we find pretty much the same distinction, clearly overlapping. Danto calls it analytical and substantive. Mandelbaum calls it formal and material. Drey calls it critical and speculative. So many philosophers of history have used this distinction and made different uses of it. Michael Oakeshott made a similar distinction, though he turned it into a tripartite distinction by adding a category that we could consider that was very similar to historiography. And there is also a philosophy of historiography. So you can throw that into the mix too. So it's interesting to note that this distinction is made so frequently because it doesn't really correspond with how we think about the sciences. So if we but it does correspond in this important respect that we do use terms like geology, chemistry, and biology in the same way. So geology can mean actual processes taking place in the earth, in the geosphere, or it can mean the study of these processes or the knowledge accumulated about this processes. So we can say geology means courses in geology, books about geology, etc. But it also means the actual processes. Similar for chemistry. Chemistry can mean knowledge of chemistry, or it can mean chemical interactions. Biology can mean knowledge of biology, or it can mean the actual biological processes. So since this distinction doesn't work so well applied to these familiar sciences, I mean, we make the distinction, but we don't note it. It seems clear that these sciences do try to say something substantive about geological, chemical, or biological processes. And if that is the case, history does not do this. And we have to ask why history doesn't do this, or if it should do it, or if it should not do it. So Danto, is in the first quote I read from his Analytical Philosophy of History, says that speculative philosophy of history doesn't really have anything to do with philosophy any more than history has to do with philosophy. And so Danto just outright rejects this. But how he rejects it is involved in the whole of his philosophy of history. So the central theme of Danto's philosophy of history is concerned with the logic of narrative sentences. And he explains how narrative sentences are distinct from other kinds of sentences. And to do that, he introduces what he calls the ideal chronicle. And here, I want now to insert an ideal chronicler into my picture. He knows whatever happens the moment it happens, even in other minds. He is able to give the gift of instantaneous transcription. Everything that happens across the whole forward rim of the past is set down by him as it happens and the way it happens. The resultant running account I shall call the ideal chronicle. Once E, that is the event E, is safely in the past, its full description is in the ideal chronicle. We may now think of the various parts of the ideal chronicle as accounts to which practicing historians endeavor to approximate their own accounts. So this is a response to the common observation that all histories involve selection. And the ideal chronicler gets around that by including absolutely everything in the chronicle. Nothing is excluded. It is exhaustive. It is complete, but it's not really a history. It's a chronicle. And one way to understand that is to look at what a chronicle is. So here, the Chronicle of Theophanes. Let me read a couple passages from this. So their divisions, the divisions of years was a little bit offset from ours. So from 1735 to 1736. In this year, Hisham's son Suleiman attacked the land of the Armenians, but accomplished nothing. And then entry for 736, 737. In this year, Muawiyah attacked Romania. On his way back, he fell off his horse and gave up the ghost a few days later. And then the entry for 737 to 738. In this year, Hisham's son Suleiman took many prisoners from Asia. Among them, he captured a Paphlagonian who said he was Tiberius, son of Justinian. In order to honor his own son and terrify the emperors, Hisham sent this fellow to Jerusalem with the appropriate imperial honors, soldiers, banners, and scepters. So we get this year by year account of what's going on, but that's all it is. He doesn't tell us who Hisham is. He doesn't tell us who Suleiman is. He doesn't tell us who Miawaya is, why they're doing what they're doing, what happened after. It's just a year-on-year account. So for a very different way of writing about events in the past, consider Tacitus, the Histories, a very famous Roman historian. Book 1, Section 2. The story upon which I embark is one rich in disaster, marked by bitter fighting, rent by treason, and even in peace sinister. 4 emperors perished violently. There were 3 civil wars, still more campaigns fought against the foreigner, and often conflicts which combined elements of both. So in Tacitus, we have a story. It's an account of many events that are connected by a thread, and that is a narrative thread that makes it a whole that is different from the episodic nature of a chronicle, where we have one day after another, or one week after another, one season after another. And the historical account is different from that. It involves a narrative sentence. It involves what are sometimes called because clauses, which are examples of historical explanation. When X happens because of Y, that's one way to formulate a historical explanation. So a chronicle can't really deal with temporally extended events. Like, for example, the origins of an institution. The origin of an institution may occur over hundreds of years, and a chronicle that only gives you a year-on-year account is not going to be able to tell you how this institution began so long ago and now it's matured into something. That is something that only a history can tell you. Also, discontinuous processes are difficult to account for by even an ideal chronicler who captures everything. So, for example, if you were to write a history of the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Congress meets on the 3rd of January every other year. So it's not continually in session. It has sessions, and histories of Congress will talk about the sessions, and their special sessions may be called, which are outside the regular calendar event. So there you have a history that can't be told in the form of a chronicle, because a chronicle will only give you the events as they happen and not the understanding of those events retrospectively known from what happens after the fact. So as new events unfold, new meanings are attributed to events in the past, and this continues to modify our understanding of the past. And this is consistent with the familiar idea that every generation rewrites history for its own purposes and to be meaningful to it. And we can understand why that happens, because it's not merely that they're rewriting, but they're rewriting history from a perspective in which further consequences of what happened in the past have unfolded, and they have more information about that, more information about the consequences of a past historical event. We can continue, if we wanted to write histories of the 30 Years' War and say that these events in the present are still fallout from the 30 Years' War. And it's very common to still talk about the present as the post-war period, meaning after the Second World War. So it's very common to talk about contemporary history in terms of what happened during the Second World War. Danto goes on to criticize substantive philosophy of history later in the book, saying, quote, "Knowledge of the future is incompatible with the very structures of narration, an incompatibility which is, of course, dissolved when the required knowledge is available, as it is to the historian, when the events it is knowledge of are in his past, though in the future of those events he narratively redescribes in the light of it. Hence, the philosophy of history, as an effort to perceive the narration of events in the light of knowledge of the philosopher of history's own future, is an incoherent enterprise, unquote. And certainly this can be applied to what we would call providential philosophies of history, like St. Augustine and Bossuet, which see the whole of history in terms of a salvation history, a narrative that includes an end point in the future and has a definite point of beginning in the past. It is possible, I think it's likely, that Danto also had in mind more recent ideas, not merely explicitly providential philosophies of history, but say the invisible hand from Adam Smith, or everyone's favorite bête noire from philosophy of history, Hegel, Hegel's Cunning of History, or even that other bête noire of philosophy of history, Karl Marx, with the coming of the communist millennium, which is an event believed to necessarily follow in the future from the events of the present. And we could say that these are still providential accounts of history, but employing religious surrogates. In Hegel, that is the development of absolute spirit, and in Marx, the proletarian expropriating the appropriators and founding the coming communist society. So these are, in many writers, these are considered a surrogate for religious belief, but they still provide the providential ambitions and the providential interpretation of history that gives history as a whole. We could also cite Toynbee's idea of a universal church that will come in the future, as that's going to displace civilization. So we can think of that as another idea of the whole of history where we already know what's to come. And this idea of what's to come is, you can characterize it as prophecy, as we will see Danto does. So here's another quote from Danto. We might think of philosophers of history as trying to see events as having meaning in the context of an historical whole which resembles an artistic whole, but in this case, the whole in question is the whole of history, encompassing past, present, and future. I quite agree with Professor Löwith's claim that this way of viewing the whole of history is essentially theological, or it has at all events structural features in common with theological readings of history, which is seen in toto as bearing out some divine plan. So here he makes explicit the idea that speculative philosophies of history are essentially theological and believed to have a prediction for the whole of history, including what hasn't happened yet in the future. Karl Popper is very little mentioned in Danto, either the earlier analytical philosophy of history or the later revision of narration of knowledge. But I think he's present throughout in this idea of prophecy versus prediction. Popper, in The Poverty of Historicism, is very explicit that he characterizes historicism as a belief in a predictive theory of history, and he believes this is totally wrong. Now, many people have commented that Popper uses historicism in a way that most philosophers don't, or almost no philosophers who have identified as historicists or who have identified with historicist doctrines actually agree with. But anyway, take Popper at face value, and that he's saying that historicism is an attempt to predict the future, and this is completely impossible. And Danto is very much on the same page with that. Very early in his book, he writes, "The substantive philosophies of history, insofar as I have correctly characterized them, are concerned with what I shall term prophecy." And then that's on page 9 of the Narration of Knowledge. And note 2 to this passage reads as follows: "The distinction between prediction and prophecy I borrow from Karl Popper. Popper means an unconditional prediction. He allows only conditional predictions, i.e., given condition C, then event E, or predictions derived from these. He argues that historicists not only give unconditional predictions, but give them for systems which are not legitimate to do so. Unconditional predictions are illicit only when derived from conditional ones, and then with respect to well-isolated, stationary, and recurrent systems. Society is open, however. This is not quite the sense I am giving to the notion of prophecy, as will appear, nor do I find historicism quite so illegitimate as Popper does here and there elsewhere in his writings, unquote. So here, Danto distances himself by Popper, but he also acknowledges that he's using many of the same ideas, and it's this idea of history as a predictive science that is his particular bête noire, and also Popper's, and they both reject it, and Danto rejects it because it is incoherent in light of history written in terms of narrative sentences, which he lays out the logic to narrative sentences and why history must be written in this way. So, happy birthday to Arthur Danto, 100 years, and Happy New Year.